Thank you very much. It's good to be here. Nice to see everybody back. So the topic is titled Yizkor, Passover, and Autobiographical Memory. And I wanted to just say at the outset, there's going to be more of a focus here on Yizkor than there is on Pesach itself. And I wanted to just ground the approach here. We've been talking throughout different sessions about how memory is a distributed process. It's distributed throughout the brain. It's not stored in one particular location. It's not like reaching back into a file cabinet, but instead memories are spread throughout the brains, connecting in different ways to each other. And I wanted to get into that a little bit more in detail in today's class, to look specifically at the way our memories can be organized and how that's going to become important when we think about something like the process of Yizkor or remembering a loved one. Okay, so I wanted to just give a brief outline of what we're going to try to go through today. Number one, what does it mean for memory to be a network? Number two, certain efficiency processes that change our memories, and we're going to look at one specifically called retrieval-induced forgetting. And third one, we're going to look at a process known as reconsolidation, ways that our memories change when we think about them. And so let's get started by looking first at what it means for memory to be a network. And I want you to just consider all of the things, for lack of a better technical term, that you know. So try to think about the brain has billions and billions of neurons, of brain cells devoted to your everyday functioning. But everything that you know has to also be stored in there somewhere. And I'm willing to bet that everybody on this call knows more than a billion things. And it gets to the question of how we store everything, right? So imagine all the things you know about language, all the vocabulary that you have, all the rules of language that you know. Maybe you speak more than one language. Think about names and faces of every person you are familiar with or know in your life, right? So every family member, every friend, every teacher, every celebrity, every person you read about in the news. Think about directions, right? The streets in your neighborhood that you know. Think about your knowledge of how to use a phone, how to use a computer. All of these things have to be stored in different ways in the brain. And we get into what's called combinatorial explosion, right? The explosion of combinations, if we try to envision one brain cell for every single task that we do or every single thing that we know. It would simply be too much. And so we need to think of ways that the same infrastructure, right, the same brain cells can be used for multiple things. And when it comes to knowledge, that's where we get into thinking of memory as a network. So when I use the phrase knowledge, I'm using it to mean both, right? Anything that you know is a memory. Right? Whether it's a memory of when you learned it or how you learned it or how you do it, in all of those cases, for the purpose of today's talk, we're going to refer to those things as knowledge. We can get to finer distinctions within memory, but we're not going to do that today. And so given the finite nature of the brain, right, we often draw an analogy from the brain to a computer. And it's an analogy that started in the 50s and 60s and is becoming more and more accurate in terms of our knowledge of the brain is increasing as we learn more about computers, and our knowledge of what computers can do is increasing as we learn more about the brain. There's a very nice synergy between them, and the earliest models of memory really track the earliest models of computers, because the scientists were thinking that if we can train a computer to do it, then maybe that would somehow reflect something along the lines of what the mind does. And there's been a lot of success. We're certainly not there yet, but there's been a lot of, small successes in terms of modeling different things that the brain can do. So what does it mean for the brain, for memory to be stored in a network? It means that cells in the brain that are used for one process are simultaneously used for another process. And so instead of having a cell that represents celery, and a cell that represents lettuce, and a cell that represents cucumbers, you might have a cell that represents green vegetables. And anytime you think about a green vegetable, that cell gets activated. Well, now that cell is being used for dozens of different objects, and you've expanded the capacity of what you can use your brain for by using one cell for many, many things at once. And so your mental representation of celery, instead of being one brain cell, right, which you might think is efficient, actually the concept of celery is going to be made up of hundreds of brain cells, which might seem to you inefficient, but those same hundreds of brain cells will store thousands of concepts. And it's just about different patterns within those brain cells that lead us into that representation. I want to get to a practical example without getting too technical here. So I thought that I would give the example of my memory of my grandfather. Before I do that, just emphasize that the reason that we think of memory as associative, or right, I think of something and it draws an association to something similar. Well, the underlying theory behind that is that there is overlapping infrastructure, right? Overlapping brain cells that store similar things. And so when you think of one thing, it makes you think of something similar. So let me get to an example here. We're thinking about the topic of Yizkor, and I'm particularly thinking about my Zeta, my grandfather who passed a couple of years ago. And I have a representation of him as a person. I actually have a cell in my brain that's likely devoted to his face specifically. This might be one of the exceptions where there might be one cell for one face, not 100% clear. But my representation of my grandfather is going to have many different expressions. So I might think of his ears and eyes, which were some of his distinctive characteristic facial features, right? He had very, very, blue eyes. I might think of his demeanor, right? And how he had a certain sense of propriety that stuck out in my family. I might think of his professional life, or his volunteer work, which was connected because he was an accountant and ended up doing finances for a lot of Jewish nonprofit organizations. I might think of the way he dressed, right? How he wore suits and ties, and he was very particular about his suits and ties, but also his house coat that he wore around the house. I might think about other kind of more leisure or personal interest activities, whether those are my memories of preparing for Pesach with him, or going to shul with him, or watching sports with him, or playing baseball with him. I might think of other things that define his personality, like him being this type of up by his bootstraps type of person, or somebody who liked to work with his hands. So he gardened and he made wine and he made pickles and he was very handy around the house, and he was a very big proponent of a certain work ethic. And so all of these things are going to get activated in my mind when I think of my grandfather. So these are all different characteristics or different traits that I would associate with my grandfather, and all of these different traits are going to have other associations in my mind. And so the consequence of a network of representation is that when we think about that person that we're thinking about in the Yizkor experience, we're not just thinking about them, or really that the act of thinking about them is activating this diverse and expansive network of the things that we associate with them, of everything they stood for, and characteristics, character traits, hobbies, things that we remember them for. And so I would even go as far as saying is that this part of your brain is caused by them, right? And this is more of a specific philosophical point that I'm not going to get into, but would be happy to debate about what it is that your representation of this person is in the physical world. And so when you go through the Yizkor experience, in my opinion, you are activating the knowledge in your brain, the physical parts of your brain that represent that person. And so that is one instantiation of that person in the real material world. And that this network that represents this person connects to other knowledge in the brain, right? So your knowledge sort of come back to the example that I had. I might think of my grandfather in terms of winemaking because he made his own wine, and that's going to make me think about other knowledge that I have about wine. So it might highlight a memory of going on a winery tour in the Golan, or thinking about different names of wines that I'm familiar with, though his wine was probably not this caliber. So I might think about pickling and half sours and full sours and things that I know about growing cucumbers and pickles. I might think about his profession. So I might think about accountants and actuaries and be reminded that my taxes are due soon. And there's all kinds of associations that I might make when thinking about my grandfather. Now, this notion of an associative network, right, that when we think of a person, this person has kind of vast associations in our lives. So we can take this a step further and say, well, it's not just about them, it's about you, right? It's about our own experiences with that person, or even our own self-definition. So we have people who are very close to us who are central to our sense of who we are, right? So our sense of who we are might have a strong reference to certain important people in our lives, family members, teachers, etc. And so when this person, right, when we are constantly referencing knowledge, we constantly connect it to that loved one. But over time, after a person passes, some of those memories are going to get replaced. Some of them are going to fade over time. Maybe we're not going to think about that person as often because we're not talking to them. We're not seeing them. We're not taking care of them. We're not having those conversations. And so the representation of that other person becomes less and less accessible. And so the first process that I want to emphasize here is that the memory is subject to simple fading. Simple, just as our memory of the person fades, as we have fewer new memories about that person, the memory gets weaker and weaker. And Yizkor to an extent is combating this process, but I want to talk about a second process before I really look specifically at that. So we're talking about memory here as a network. The network means that different parts of the mind or the brain are being accessed when thinking about a person, and that creates all kinds of associations in our minds, and that those associations fade as that person is we're less around that person. So process number 2 is more of an active process. So if process number 1 was about simple fading, right? Simply memories are farther away, they become less accessible, which I think is something that you don't need to be a memory scientist to appreciate that. Process number 2 has a greater emphasis on the actual limits to our storage capacity. And so if we are using this overlapping infrastructure, these same cells to represent similar concepts, then at some point, we might run into problems if the same infrastructure is going to be representing two different concepts, and which one is going to pop into our minds. And so there's a process, right? It can get pretty crowded. And forgetting is actually an important part of memory, right? It's very important that we remember the information that is most useful and that we forget the information that isn't useful. And because there isn't a little me inside my head deciding which memories I want to keep and putting them in a scrapbook and which memories would be more efficient to get rid of, we have processes designed to take the most current information and prioritize it. And so I'll give you an example. An example is finding your car in the parking lot, right? Think of we work in different places. Imagine you drive somewhere on a regular basis, whether it's your work, whether it's a mall or something, and you're parking your car in the same parking lot. You have in your mind many memories of parking in that same lot, and it's likely not in the same spot every time. And so how do you keep that straight? How do you remember after 2 hours in the shopping mall or after a full day of work where your car is? Because much as we grumble or joke about how we can't find our car, it's actually pretty amazing how often we do find our cars and how little difficulty we actually have, given that when you walk out into that parking lot, there is nothing that distinguishes that day of parking there from any other time in your life that you've parked there. So how on earth do we keep that straight? And so the process of retrieval-induced forgetting is a process that is hypothesized that states that when we encounter something similar to a previous experience, if we interpret them as being the same, we then forget the earlier experience and update it with the new experience. So if there's information like this that we need to keep track of, we use the underlying rule of the more current information is likely the more accurate information. If events or experiences are unique enough, then we won't get them confused. But right, so if you go to a baseball game and you watch you watch the Orioles win the World Series, you're not going to forget about that because you go watch them, lose in an exhibition game the next time around. But to the extent that things are similar, we will forget experiences, or we will push them down in memory and say, well, that representation isn't really being used anymore. We are now using this more current representation. And so this process of forgetting, of fading, of retrieval-induced forgetting, these are ways that keep the brain efficient, right? So I want to be clear that the brain is massive, right? We have billions of neurons, trillions of connections between our cells. Your average neuron connects to somewhere between 100 and 1,000 other neurons. But still, we are limited in our capacity. We can't do everything. And the brain needs to maintain efficiency because it's not only how much we do, but it's how quickly we do it, right? We need to be able to respond quickly and to act in a real-time environment. And so, unfortunately, what this means is that older memories get pushed to the background. And if they are older memories of a loved one with whom we're not making new memories, that means that those memories of those individuals are going to fade to the background, different degree for different people, but we are going to be thinking of this person less and less. And I believe that Yizkor is about fighting this process. It's about keeping that person alive in our memories and saying that there is this memory process that's going on, this natural process, something we don't need to feel bad about, but there's a natural process that is going to lead our memories of that close relative, of that loved individual, that's going to make them fade more and more and be less and less accessible. I actually had I had an interesting talk with my dad this year, who's on the call, and he told me around Simchat Torah. So because of COVID, there was somebody who he saw every single year on Simchat Torah who would talk to him about his father, right? So my other Zeta, not the one who I gave the example of, was somebody who he used to come to Toronto. He was very active. He used to go down to the local Chabad and lead them out into the streets carrying the Sefer Torah. And there was somebody who always would talk to my dad about his father on Simchat Torah. And he said he felt this surge of guilt after Simchat Torah when he said, wow, I didn't think of my father today on Simchat Torah, and this is the first time it's happened. And so the ritual of Yizkor and Yortzeit makes us, or gets us, or encourages us to take commemorative action, to spend a few minutes, right? The Yizkor prayer is not it's not a grand show from the Chazan like a lot of our tefillot are. The Yizkor prayer is much more muted, right? There's an introduction, and then there's your own private tefillah, and it's your time, and you are meant to be thinking about that loved one and really engaging with that memory of them. And so when we engage in these rituals, what we are doing is we are strengthening the cells in our brains that represent these people. We are reactivating the parts of the brain. The brain has a very simple principle. It's called use it or lose it, right? The brain gets rid of elements, aspects that aren't used. It stops devoting resources to them and devotes its resource to what's more current. And so what Yizkor does is it, 4 times a year, it says, or 5 times a year, if you're going to observe a yahrzeit, it says, hey, this is current information, right? Keep this, this is important. And by activating those memories, we give a certain biological instantiation to those people in our lives. And that is something that keeps us grounded in a sense of family, in a sense of history, and in the relationships that are important to us and to who we are. So I'll pause here, and I'll take questions if anybody has them, because this is the kind of end of the second process before we talk about the third process.
I guess I will ask one question, I guess. Back in your previous slide, when you talked about it, your slide said your self-identification. Mm-hmm. Maybe you addressed it, and I missed some of it. Could you kind of summarize how your self-identification affects this process?
Sure. So if our memories, our memories are associative, right? We have things, how we represent somebody else can have all the different aspects of their life that we represent about them. There's going to be a certain amount of overlap between our representation of them and us, either in terms of pivotal experiences that we've had with these people that have shaped us, or things that we see in ourselves, right? Like a genetic thing that's similar between you and your parents. So you think of similarities. So, or if it's family history and stories that we've heard from our parents that contribute to our sense of kind of who we are located in this broader nexus of things, in this family history.
is there any evidence that a year or month depending strengthens memory versus those who don't? I'm not sure if I get the question exactly.
Is the question about like a significance of like a year has a certain significance in memory, or a month having a certain significance in memory, making the link to the cycle of mourning?
Oh, I guess that's what it is. It sounds like it must be that.
So I would say that not from a like brain biology. What's that?
Yeah, in terms of saying Kaddish also.
Right. So one of the biggest significances of a year is more like social rather than from a brain point of view, which is just that like you go through the full cycle of the year and you have all these experiences that could link to this person, and those all serve as reminders. So that's less about like brain biology per se than it is about how a year affects our experiences. And I think that that's probably a very similar notion underlying why Kaddish is a year and why the notion of a Yortzeit. Right now, in terms of the brain, it seems as though when it comes to forming memories, a couple weeks out seems to be an important milestone, and then somewhere between 6 months and 2 years seems to be an important milestone, and they're not there yet in terms of narrowing down more specifically. I'm thinking of a study that has brought people back over certain intervals and shown how put them in brain scanners while they're recalling certain things and showing processes within the hippocampus that change over the course of a few weeks and over the course of a few years. But we don't have the kind of precision to say 1 year is an important landmark. We right now know of this as more of a gradual process that by a couple of years, by about 2 years out, we know your brain has gone through most of the kind of, call it fossilizing almost, of becoming more static and less kind of live and open to change.
So the follow-up that he asks is regarding emotions. What about emotions if your loved one passed while you are on good or bad terms with them? How much do emotions impact that memory?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's I don't know about emotions like at the time of passing. I imagine that the emotional connection to a loved one is going to be far deeper than that. And so people might have a certain experience surrounding, like people, sometimes you have people with this experience of, oh my God, the last thing that happened was we had a fight, or they feel this great sense of comfort because of what they were able to say to them towards the end. I don't know if those things influence the memories long term, because this is the things about emotion and memory in the literature are more about single event experiences, where a highly emotional single experience could influence your memory in a certain way. But we're not talking, when a loved one passes away, we're not talking about a single experience. We're talking about a lifetime of experiences. And so I'm not sure how the specifics of one later memory might impact things.
Okay.
Good.
I have a quick question. Hi.
Yeah.
So, I wanted to know what you think about grief dreams, or dreams of loved ones who've passed away. I have been reading a lot about this, and I've got my mayor's thing on. I'm also just here as a Yid. And but reading a lot about grief dreams and processing and the different energies around them. My family and I often talk about dreams that we have of our family members in the other world, around, of course, around Pesach, around holidays, that association. I have a rabbi that talks about the significance of your Kol Nidre night dreams, and all that type of stuff. And there's a biological and psychological and then also spiritual component to it. I would love to know your thoughts on all of those. And I will just say I was really blessed that last night, actually, I had a dream of my aunt and my great aunt, and especially the aunt. They both are nifter, but the my mother's sister, we would always have Pesach by her and everything, and it was like almost like a lucid dream. I knew it was a dream, and I was able to give her a hug and to smell her and all of that, and so that's why I'm asking.
Yeah, thanks for that question. As a cognitive psychologist, I imagine you're going to be thoroughly dissatisfied with what I have to say about dreaming, because I don't have like a particular approach to dreaming, but from a cognitive point of view, we look at what happens in dreams as the way information is organized. So I can't tell you why you would have a certain dream or what that dream means, but what I could say is that we've got part of our mental capacity, which is about trying to make sense out of what's going on inside of us. And so, when we have a dream, it is often a representation of lots of different common concerns or current concerns. So you're having dreams about family members around Pesach time. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's because you're thinking about Pesach, and that's, again, through these associations, that's connecting to these people who are so closely associated to Pesach for you. And the smell, right? You might have a strong association with a certain smell with those people, and those things can all come together during a dream as your memories are being brought to consciousness. Now, the reason I say that that's dissatisfying is because it doesn't really explain why. It doesn't really explain why this dream, or what's the significance of this dream, and why did you dream about this loved one and not that loved one, or why did you dream about it today and not another day. And I don't find deep insights in dreams, because what I think they tell us is about what we are thinking, which that can be insightful. And my experience talking to people about dreaming has given me the suggestion that I don't have as powerful dreams as other people do. But I do think that there's something to the associations. So it could be that something that happened on a given day raised this awareness of this person in your mind, but did so in a kind of under the radar way that it only really made its way into your consciousness during a dream. But I don't know more about how we get from point A to Z. The third process I wanted to discuss was about reactivating memories. And the terminology that we use for the terminology that we use is called consolidation, and it's meant to talk about how memories become more compact over time. And in a sense, right, that fades our memories. So memories become less dependent on the hippocampus, which we talked about in our first session. It's a small part deep inside your brain that is very important for memory storage and memory formation, but that over time, our memories become independent of the hippocampus. So when we first commit something to memory, it's going to be highly active in terms of the hippocampus communicating with other parts of the brain. And eventually, the rest of the parts of the brain where the memory is going to be stored are going to detach from the hippocampus, and they are going to be now independent of the hippocampus, right? The hippocampus is a busy part of the brain. We need it for other things. And so we can't devote the energy from the hippocampus to keep all of our memories that fresh and that current. So over time they fade, and that fading goes along with detaching from the hippocampus. Now, there's an experiment that happened in the year 2000 that introduced this terminology called reconsolidation. It says our memories, after they have occurred, can go through this process of consolidation a second time. And so we can bring a memory to mind after it has happened, readjust our thinking about it, and change what we thought happened. And so I'm going to show you a little schematic of this experiment, and I'll ask you to just bear with me for a couple minutes. Try to keep up with this, and if you can't, don't worry about the details. But it's a memory about rats, and it's a 3-condition memory. So the rats in each of the 3 conditions are getting a different pattern. They're getting shocked. So my apologies if anybody is sensitive or squeamish about that, but it's common practice in the research world. And so they've introduced an injection of what's called anisomycin, and that is a protein inhibitor. So it prevents the rat from growing proteins or creating proteins. And effectively, for our purposes, what that does is it prevents memory from occurring. Now, one of the most basic things that you know if you've taken an introductory course in psychology is that if you shock a rat under a certain cue, if the rat thinks it's in that position again, it will freeze. And we interpret that to mean that it's expecting another shock. And so condition 1 is the very, very baseline. They shock a rat while they play a distinctive tone. And they inject the rat at the same time or right before with this anisomycin. And then 2 days later, when they play that tone, the rat doesn't freeze, right? So the rat would normally freeze, but they play the tone and the rat doesn't freeze, which is an indication that the anisomycin worked. It worked to prevent memory formation in the rat. Now, condition 2 is to prove that anisomycin is not this like all out block everything in your memories. So it's not like a night of hard drinking where, you know, you black out, you don't remember what happened the day before. So what they do is on day 1, they pair the same tone with the shock. On day 2, they inject the rat with anisomycin. And on day 3, they play the tone, and now the rat freezes. Because 2 days earlier, that tone came with a shock. And so the rat is showing here that 2 days later, despite being injected with anisomycin in between, in the interim, the rat remembers the initial experience. And so now we get to the pivotal condition, condition 3, where on day 1, again, the rat hears a tone and is shocked. On day 2, the rat hears a tone again, and instead of getting shocked, it gets anisomycin. So it gets the injection on day 2. So instead of the second condition, where the rat just got the injection on day 2, now on day 2, the rat gets the injection and it also gets a reminder, right? It hears that tone. Hey, remember what happened last time this tone was played? That's what the rat is getting alongside anisomycin. And on day 3, the rat doesn't respond to the tone. So in other words, we know that the protein inhibitor anisomycin blocks memory while an event is being experienced. And we know that if a day after the event is experienced, the anisomycin doesn't affect the memory. But if you're thinking about that memory, if the rat is reminded of the initial experience on day 2, the anisomycin will come in and block its original memory. In other words, this this drug injection will go back in time and knock out a memory, but only if the rat is made aware of that memory. So bringing something to mind, right, thinking about a memory, opens that memory up to the possibility of change. Okay, so just to make sure we're clear, what we're showing here is that anisomycin on its own can prevent you from remembering an experience during the injection, but it can also prevent you from remembering an experience that you were thinking about during the injection. And so the question then becomes, can we apply these findings to human beings, right? Because generally, don't be dismayed, but our brains are rather similar to rat brains. They're some of our closest living relatives, and especially the hippocampus is very similar from our brains to rat brains. Some of the more advanced stuff you have to look in chimpanzees to get, or other apes to get a better view. But the question now becomes, can we apply this finding to human beings? And we can't really go around sticking human beings with protein inhibitors. It just doesn't really work that way. So from an ethical point of view, so let's take a look at some research. Actually, some of the lead researchers in this field are in the Weizmann Institute in Israel, and they published this paper in 2011 in Science. Science, right, one of the most prestigious scientific journals out there. And let's walk through what they did with human beings here. So people would watch a video in a group of 5. All right, so 5 people would watch a video together. And then the honest truth is that I'm not sure if only one of these 5 people was actually part of the experiment, or if they just took all 5 people separately. And they quizzed them on it individually. They quizzed them on the video on 3 days later, 7 days later, and 14 days later. So 3 days later, they just want to know what people remember. 7 days later, they start to introduce incorrect information. So the experimenters give them false information with the pictures of the 4 people who were there. So they ask them a question about what they saw in the video, and they show them a photo of the other 4 people next to a quote of what they said. And they do this strategically so that in some circumstances, they're introducing false information about what happened and the impression that it came from those other 4 people that were in the experiment with you. Now at test 3, so on day 14, they identify, so before we get to test 3, there's 2 different streams that false information can take, right? So let's say on test 2, right, on day 7, they accept and they go along with the crowd on that piece of information, right? They say the wrong thing, like the 4 other people, so to speak, said. They could revert back to their original answer a week later, or they could stick with the group a week later when they're no longer being pressured. Nobody's reminding them, hey, these other 4 people said this. And they find that people do both, and that there's a different thing going on in the brain when they stick with the group and when they don't stick with the group. And so what they found was, when that information that they accepted from other people, when it stuck with them from day 7 to day 14, there's a certain connection in the brain from the amygdala to the hippocampus. So the amygdala is known as an emotion processing area of the brain, but it also has been associated with certain social processes. So it's not surprising, or at least we can make sense of this, that there's a certain pathway in these 2 regions of the brain that is active only when they take information, false information from other people, right? They ran another condition where they gave them the same false information, but said it came from a computer. And we don't see this same pathway. We see this pathway in the brain when they're accepting false information from other people, and that 7 days later, they have still accepted that information. And that part of the brain, that amygdala, that pathway is only activated when there are social influences on memory. And so I wanted to kind of open up this question and ask what this means for the power or the importance of communal rituals, right? Because I think what it's showing us is a real value to not just how memory can change, but how memory can change from social influences, and how we have evolved to accept memories from social influences. So 3 steps here in this process. Number 1, our memories can change after the fact. Number 2, it's not just peer pressure, right? It persists a week later. Number 2, we can identify a part of the brain that is dedicated specifically to this memory change. And number 3, that memory change, that pathway is specific to social influence. And so it's not only that our memories change, but it's that our memories, have probably adapted to change this way, to take information from other people and to incorporate it into our own memories, to treat it as if we experienced it. And so if we bring this back now to the Yizkor concept, to the concept of, well, now I'm reactivating this memory of this person. I lived in a dynamic relationship with this person for as long as they were in my life. And now they're gone, and I'm saying Yizkor for them, but I have changed, right? I walk into Yizkor, a changed person, and I bring that dynamism in with me. I reactivate memories. I keep those memories alive in such a way that I'm constantly changing, and my interaction with this person who's no longer with us can keep changing in a very real, live way because of how those memories are open to change when they've been reactivated, right? So we can engage, even if the people we've lost aren't changing, right? We are changing, and we can maintain that relationship in a certain level as we ourselves change. So I wanted to kind of pause there, and we can, if we have a few minutes at the end, we can talk about Seder night and the Haggadah, but I wanted to just pause there and take any questions about the reconsolidation or the Yizkor process or anything along those lines. I guess I could elaborate a little bit on what Miriam is saying. I think this is a very poignant observation, right? That if you surround yourself with people who lie, then you open yourself up to that influence, right? That being in a framework where people are saying something can, if you let your guard down, it can allow the falsehood to come in. And that even, you may not be aware of those potential influences on you.
Very much like Pirkei Avot says.
I'd like to ask Azi one question, if I may.
Of course.
I just, what I find fascinating is that things change due to social circumstance, and it even opens up a new neuron. And I'm wondering to what extent that relates to communal prayer, creating a certain reality, and that sometimes the group social reality may actually be something that the brain craves for, is more significant, and represents a truth that's slightly different than the individual truth we have. and that, I'm thinking about it also in terms of, I would say even the lethal dependence some people place towards minyonim in these days, and how it could relate to craving a certain social reality. So I thought if you wanted to comment about that, Doctor, I'd be happy to hear your thoughts.
So I certainly agree with the notion. I think that the social impulse, or that craving, as you phrase it, is very real. I think that we are social creatures. We're highly dependent on our social worlds. And, I think that what a lot of people have been experiencing in the last year, minyanim is one example, but a loss of so many different social outlets. I think that when you get into like a social reality, you start to get very esoteric in a way that I find exciting, but also hard to keep track of. So we could talk about some kind of shared representation that all members of the group have, and we can talk about the group existing as independent of any of the individuals who contribute to it. And so I think you're getting more at the second, and I think that is a very hard, it's a very hard concept to talk about in at least in scientific terms, right? Because where like you have the reality that is housed in all these individuals, but it requires more than each individual. It's independent of the individuals, and so it gets kind of really complicated really fast, but also I think really exciting. And I think that the fact that we have all this mental infrastructure that's there to take meaning from the group, take information from the group, is just a testament to how group dependent we are and how real that that social influence is. I have students in my classes who say something like, "So professor, you're saying that this is, all of these factors are a social construction, which means that they're not real." And I'll say to them, what's more real than a social construction? And that we are hardwired to readily take on the influence of our social environments. And this is one great example of it, right? That we have a particular pathway in the brain that is dedicated towards updating our memories based on what other people have told us happened.
If I could just add one thing, it would be fascinating to see how a concept like this relates to the mitzvah of kedoshim tihu, which is phrased in the plural, specifically to tell us that we only discover kedusha in a social milieu. So anyhow, right. It's a thought. I don't know if there's anything to say about it, but it's a thought.
Yeah. Thanks.
Any practical ways for people to sort of use what you're sharing to get where they want to go and to be able to remember the way I want to remember, whether on Pesach, whether on Yizkor, whether in their own ways that they activate their memory, rather than it being a passive experience. I'm wondering if you could use this knowledge to have a more powerful Yizkor experience, to have a more powerful Pesach experience. And any thoughts on how to do that, and if that is if that is an appropriate thing to do, is that something that is a meaningful thing to do?
Yeah. So I guess I'll at my first comment is that I will I don't want to have the chutzpah to say that I know what it's like to be a person who says Yizkor on a regular basis. As a chazan, I am an Ashkenazi whose my custom is to not be inside shul for Yizkor, but as a chazan who's gone to many different places, I have been inside shul on Yizkor on occasion, and I spend time thinking about my grandparents when I'm in those scenarios. So I don't have that same first person experience. So I'll just kind of preface with that. But I will say that I find that for some people, to think about your loved one, you don't need any other purpose to imbue that with. You don't need nothing else is required. That experience is powerful enough. But I do think that to have a sense of when a person goes into that when a person goes into that Yizkor experience and says those tefillot and thinks about that person, I would encourage people to think about who it is that you are and how that other person contributes to who you are, and how your memories of that person, like to think about those very visceral characteristics, like somebody mentioned the smell of a person, right? I have certain family members whose, their perfume, I can recognize it on the streets anywhere, right? So if you have that kind of visceral connection, to think about the visual imagery of being in their home, or how they used to dress, or just certain activities, to spend a few minutes trying to just focus on those particular experiences, I think would be a way to be more powerfully reactivating those memories. I'm not suggesting any magic is going to happen, that any great change is going to happen. I don't, it's a far cry from, inducing people to remember something that happened in a video to taking this and making it personal. But I do think that, for the person who wants to think of it in those terms, there's a lot of applications that could be made. And so to have a conversation with that person, to think about how you relate to that person, can make it a more powerful experience and strengthen the memory process as you're going through it.
Excellent. That's very helpful. I was wondering if you could also just give us a preview for a moment about the next session, just to whet our appetite, the Yom HaShoah, and maybe just weave that from where we began in this journey in our first series, and where we're gonna conclude in the last piece of our last session that we have together.
Sure. So I've been talking a bunch over these sessions about the meaning that we make in our memories, right? And how we interpret events in our lives, and we incorporate those events into a sense of who we are, and that process is fundamental to memory, right? I talked in the first session about how you can't have memory without meaning, you can't have memory without interpreting it. And the Shoah poses the greatest challenge of all to this, because it's a memory from which meaning cannot be made in certain respects. And I quoted Viktor Frankl, we're not sure if it was last session or the session before, but the very concept of looking at memory from the perspective of meaning comes from Viktor Frankl, who was an Auschwitz survivor, who wrote about how the process of searching for meaning within the camps was something that could distinguish the people who survived from the people who didn't. And there has been so much scholarship in the aftermath of the Holocaust, looking at how the survivors tried to story their experiences, how they tried to make sense of it, how they tried to rebuild their lives. And so I was hoping to look a little bit more closely at the process of making meaning from the Holocaust. What did it mean to survivors? What does it mean to us nowadays? And I've been recently looking through some footage of interviews with certain family members of mine, and I was thinking of the possibility of sharing some of those, or at least sharing some insights that I gained from some of those interviews.